Okay, welcome everybody to the Derek J. Fiedler YouTube channel. This is the Dialogues with Derek podcast, in which guests enter into deeper conversation into important topics like symbolism and just how the world works, the making of art. Joining me today is none other than Gareth Boyd, and Garrett is a friend. We have private conversations, so I'm very honored to have him join us today as a guest and be able to share this conversation with you all. How are you doing today, Gareth?
I'm doing fantastic. Looking forward to it, Derek.
All right. Yeah. So let me just go ahead and give the old introduction because I like to honor my guest, and then you can let me know how I do. Okay. So Gareth is the editor and author of several articles posted in the Symbolic World blog, which was initiated by Jonathan Peugeot, but it's expanded into a community of writers and editors. His collection of essays include The Symbolism of the Sword and Shield, The Way to the Country from Which the Shadows Fall, parts the first and the second, Thine Own from Thine Own, Symbolic Musings on the Eucharist, most recently, The Horse and the Rider. And he's also been the lead editor in one of my contributions on the symbolism of the burning bush. He has he's podcasting too, called The Thinking House, which I'm going to prod him to keep posting more because I really like the way that he speaks and presents his work. Profound thoroughness is probably the key attribute that I like most about you, Gareth, because anything that you do, you just seem to comb it with a fine comb. You zoom in as far as you go. So whether it's mythology or biblical passages, church liturgy, even things like foreign policy and especially symbolism, you zoom in as far as you go and get into the nitty gritty. I appreciate that. You also have a really, really awesome tone. So hopefully you guys listening will be able to hop over uh, to the Symbolic World blog and read his articles or listen to some of the audio publications he has of the articles. And you'll find that he has like this slick and very uh, uh, mysterious tone. I almost picture like, okay, is he recording this like in a darkened room with just like the desk lamp, and he has like in between sentences he like puffs his cigar or something. It's like
It makes it better.
yeah. And I would also give him the award for the best essay titles, like The Way to the Country from Which the Shadows Fall, parts the first and the second. Like easily my favorite titles. He saved me a couple of times from posting just weak titles and actually make it somewhat interesting. Beyond all of this, he's also a business owner, a veteran, husband, and father. So today we're going to be getting into a few topics. Just pick out a few from your essays and take a deeper look together. But first, I'd like to get to know your or before we get into that, I'd like to know your background and, just like what was your childhood like, coming of age, and how did you arrive to the symbolic world and be the contributor that you are? All right. How'd I do?
Beautiful, beautiful. I would,
Right.
yeah. The podcast thing is mainly in its experimental phase at the moment, so that needs a little bit of work. But I do need prodding to continue to make that happen because I procrastinate.
Well, I'd say, yeah, man, it's worth the effort, I'd say, because the tone carries over from, like the writing tone that the reader would imagine, like myself. It carries over well to you, you know, reading out the articles, or I don't know, maybe even having some conversations like these in the mix there too.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, that's basically your channel is definitely one that stands out as one that you create content that I really enjoy, and I, I like the idea of creating similar content. This video conversation stuff like that, because I have a lot of good conversations with people, and I know sometimes after the fact there's this idea that it might be that other folks would enjoy, at least being able to witness those conversations as well. Because I get to
Yep.
talk to really cool people like yourself and a lot of the others. in the symbolic world circle, and there's some really cool conversations to have.
Yeah, that's really the big motivation for me. It's like these things are happening privately, but I just think of my friends or the viewers, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is too good. Like I really want to be able to share some of these amazing insights, or like I just love maybe like how John Vervaeke talks about the dialogos, where you take two people and through conversation, both people arrive further along in the intellectual or spiritual journey than they could have arrived just thinking about it or writing about it themselves.
Yeah, and I think there's something about the bigger conversation as well. So like in the symbolism kind of circles, it's adjacent to like the meaning crisis circles with John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson and all these cats, and then it's adjacent to certain ortho internet circles where there's lots of infighting. But the conversations that we have privately, in a lot of ways, are informed by those other conversations that we're either listening to or watching or reading about, and it's everything is informing everything else. It's this web, this network of people, some of whom know one another personally, many of whom don't, but the whole conversation grows and blossoms as a result of that. So yeah, actually putting stuff out there instead of just keeping it private, I think does a great service to the furthering of that greater conversation.
Yeah. And it's funny you're talking about this, web in the corner of the internet, but like I don't know, do you guys have daddy long legs where you're from in Louisiana? Okay, so we have like Louisiana, or we have daddy long legs out here in California, and like one just snagged a fly and is like in the process of like wrapping it up right now. I'm like, oh man. All right, you go. Good catch. So how'd you get to this point, Gareth, to where you're, active member in the symbolic world? What was it like growing up and coming of age, and then, finding this corner of the internet?
Yeah, so I grew up in a rather I would say devout Protestant Pentecostal household. We were at church a lot, very involved in church. Most of my friends were church friends. I was homeschooled, so as were most of the friends that I had in the church. So it was great. Everyone wasn't homeschooled, but a lot of them were, and we were all at church together quite frequently. So that was a big part of the community that I had growing up. And I look back with a lot of fondness and thankfulness for those experiences and the way my parents raised me. So that all kind of played into it. Got to college and was very involved in Chi Alpha Christian Ministries. Is a campus ministry for the Assemblies of God.
Oh, I'm very familiar with them. I connected with them when I was over at Davis.
Okay, yeah.
They're called like the Davis Christian Fellowship, but behind that is Chi Alpha.
Yeah. So I did a lot of stuff with Chi Alpha all through college.
You don't say.
Very involved in all of that. We met a lot of great people, had a lot of really, really cool formative experiences. I guess after college, I stopped attending church as frequently. I was always really involved, helping out with sounds and lights and all kinds of stuff in easily like a dozen different churches around town. I kind of got burnt out with all of that. So stopped really attending regularly. Started reading a lot of Carl Jung and I guess going through, I don't know if you would call it a crisis of faith. I didn't really feel like I was in a crisis. I don't
like a quasi crisis.
Well, it was I was leaving one thing, and I was entering. I guess you could call it a wilderness. I suppose. Like I was leaving. I was certainly leaving Protestantism. I wasn't moving into Orthodoxy or anything like that. I wasn't necessarily moving into anywhere as much as I was simply leaving one place.
Kind of like a drifting.
Yeah, there was very much a meandering, wandering sort of thing for a few years. Heavily informed by Carl Jung. I learned a lot um, of good things in my reading of Carl Jung, um, that brought me to a place where when I discovered Jordan Peterson, um, like I grokked with everything he was saying and the way he was saying this. Jordan Peterson's obviously heavily Jungian, well read in Nietzsche, and these were influences that were very much shaping my worldview at the time. And so I,
Man, he must have just like tied it all together.
yeah, it was perfect. It was like it was all the stuff that I was sort of feeling, thinking, except articulated better and with more gravitas and wisdom behind it, I suppose. Like it was, I was kind of leaning in all of this direction already, and then this kind of comes in. I think it might have been the same day as I discovered Jordan Peterson. I watched, I think it was the first video that he had done with Jonathan Peugeot.
With Pepe?
Not the Pepe one. Pepe one is part two of a two-part
Oh.
conversation. So this was the part one that I watched. I watched Pepe later, but I watched part one and was very intrigued. Didn't know a whole lot about orthodoxy. I don't recall the precise, we'll say, march of events after that, but it wasn't long before we decided to try to visit the local Orthodox church here, and everything kind of fell into place.
So you're saying that, like, was it through Jonathan
Definitely.
that
Yeah,
it was
definitely.
an introduction into Orthodoxy?
Yes, or at
Eastern
least
Church?
yeah, this sort of introduction to this a symbolic worldview, which I had these kind of like premonitions of, I guess, but like everything coalesced and crystallized and became so much more clear. Listening to Jonathan talk about icons and the symbolic worldview and the hierarchy and the logos and all of this stuff. So anyway, all that to say, my delving into Jung prepared me for Peterson, and there's a lot of other thinkers that were highly influential as well. And then Peterson kind of prepared me for some of Jonathan's stuff, and then it progressed from there. During the time where I was really, I guess, leaving Protestantism and reading a lot of Jung, a friend and I had found that we were really on similar parallel tracks. Really interested in exploring the possibility of purpose in the world, not wanting to sort of get past the limitations of the worldview that we had in our childhood, while still, I guess, recognizing the great things about it, realizing that there was probably better ways of articulating, transcendental meaning and like all this purpose and all this stuff. So
You guys were looking for a language.
we were looking, yeah, absolutely. I wound up finding it eventually. We started to try to make up our own, I guess, or sort of find our own way. We had a website that was somewhat popular for a couple of years called The Way to Actuality, in which we did something very similar to what the Symbolic World blog wound up becoming.
Oh, interesting.
We would write things sort of a quasi-religious, philosophical, psychological nature. We had other guest writers who would come and write in similar veins, all about exploring the possibility of purpose and meaning. We started to try to deconstruct the idea of faith and then reconstruct. We had this whole idea about faith design and being able to design a faith on some sort of structure by which the individual could find meaning through life. Anyway, it was all, looking back, there was a lot of naivete about it and a lot of bumbling and wrong-headed ideas. But there was an honest searching for something that I think I've found now within Orthodoxy and within, especially as it's manifested in the symbolic world lately.
Yeah, it seems like you're still progressing forward, even amongst the naivety and maybe through the brushwork, I guess, of the woods. But then it seems like you kind of arrived to the center of the wood.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly how it feels now. I've been Orthodox for a few years now, and each year I realize I don't see things quite the way I did the year before. But there's always there's a discernible direction in which I'm progressing. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, usually slowly. But being able to discern that I am moving in a direction is, of course, encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
Wound up a few years back, Jonathan Peugeot came down to Louisiana for a few talks, and went to see him there. Wound up meeting David Flores, and this was, I guess, later this year is when the Symbolic World blog kind of kicked off, and volunteered to lend my meager talents to that as one of the editors. There's a small handful of editors. Everybody kind of works under JP. He's the boss editor for everything. But yeah, I've had the opportunity to work with yourself and several other, like I couldn't even count them all up, quite a few other writers who've written articles for the Symbolic World, and some of them are just, I mean, I'm frequently blown away by how sharp these people are. Like there's some, we've got some really good writers, and I've been able to write a few articles and have a dozen more in the making.
Yeah, I'm definitely one that has like, I don't know how many outlines and jottings and rough drafts, and then it's like in 6 months it's like, here's one article, you know. It's like, I hope my goal is to uptick that frequency of posting and submitting drafts and all of that. Like I took a break. I'm definitely like a seasonal YouTuber where like 9 months, I'm just like all in and I'm into it, but then like for some reason, like it starts to get a little bit blurry and hazy, and I'm like, get to that point where it's like a week goes by and I'm like, how many days in a row did I just watch like 4 hours of YouTube and I don't even remember what I was watching, kind of thing. And I'm like starting to feel like this thing is becoming more me and I'm serving it rather than the other way around. And so I'll take these like, I don't know, breaks, maybe sabbaticals, where I'm just like kind of like cleansing. But it's not like I get distracted and move on to something else on the other side of that. Like at this point, I'm more ramped up and ready to go than ever before. And that jotting list is growing, and I'm like, okay, it's time to get some stuff on there again.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah. So, all right. So you get to the point where we're caught up, man. That's your story. You're here at the Symbolic World, editor, contributing. I was revisiting some of your articles recently, and there was a couple that I wanted to highlight and maybe have you explain just a little bit more in detail and kind of see where the conversation goes from there. But before we get there, like, yeah, I feel like there's a few parts of your bio that we skipped over. So, yeah. I mean, like, you arrived here, but from what I know, you're a soldier and you spent time overseas. So, like, how did that, play out in your journey and who you are today?
Yeah, so growing up, I was always interested in martial arts and military history, stuff like that. So I always had this idea that I wanted to be a soldier. After about a year and a half, 2 years at university, I had changed majors 2 times, wasn't, kind of just spinning my wheels and going nowhere. So I decided, well, this is as good a time as any to go ahead and join the military. So I joined the Army Reserve and went to basic and all that, and came back with the intention of going through ROTC and making a career out of the military. And that's just not the way things really panned out. I decided pretty quickly on that I liked the idea of being a soldier say the idea of being a soldier doesn't quite match the reality. As an organization, the United States military is not as well run as you might think from the movies. So Yeah,
Was it
so
like Full Metal Jacket or something? So like
uh,
that boot camp scene. Yeah.
bunch of idiots who have no idea what they're doing, and they frequently get put in positions of authority, which means that the tasks that they set themselves to are executed often poorly. There are definitely exceptions in the military, but this was unfortunately a lot of my experience, and that was uh, a frustrating thing to, I guess, be a part of. Um, so yeah, I was a reservist, so 1 weekend a month, 2 weekends out of the year for the majority of my time in the military. But I did, I guess, when people ask what I did in the military, I generally talk about a little over a year that I spent in Iraq. So that was, I'm really glad I was able to go to Iraq, because otherwise my time in the military, I probably would have looked back and felt that it was wasted. So um, I was glad to be able to go and have those experiences in Iraq. I went in
Oh, I
2010.
appreciate that you did.
Um,
Thanks, man.
well, everybody, it's not definitely not for everybody.
Yeah,
It's
the
something
few, the
I think I always
chosen, right?
wanted to do. Yeah, and I'm really glad that I was able to do that. I went in 2010, 2011. Most of the fighting in Iraq had died down. I wasn't kicking down doors and having buddies get blown up like a lot of the guys were. So my experience of the war is not, again, not quite like the movies. There were some areas we were in that were more active than others, um, but I was really fortunate in my deployment to most of the time be rather safe and not see a bunch of terrible things. Um, and I think we did good work while we were there. And I look back with fondness on the experiences.
What was the type of work?
So um, there were a group of folks in my unit that were activated and attached to the special operations mission in Iraq. So we went to kind of like provide support to the special forces and SEALs and all that stuff. Wasn't a cool guy, was just with the cool guys. So that right off the bat was a really cool thing. I wasn't just going to Iraq. I was going, we were going to be providing support to the Green Berets. That was a really cool, exciting thing. But my main job, there was it gets kind of complicated to explain. There was a big upgrade project going on in the special operations community in the Arabian Peninsula, so in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Some special equipment was getting issued to all of the special forces and SEAL teams. And so I had a team of a bunch of contractors representing the different defense contractors that were associated with this upgrade project. We traveled around the country to all the special forces and SEAL teams, got these guys the new equipment, took their old equipment, transferred things like weapon systems and sensitive electronics from the old equipment to the new equipment, trained up those guys on the new equipment if they needed it, and then moved on to the next location. So I got to travel around Iraq a lot and meet a whole lot of people. And yeah,
Now, did you go to Afghanistan as well?
I did not go to Afghanistan.
So you're traveling and going from post to post just within the country of Iraq?
Yeah, flying around within Iraq a whole lot.
Man, yeah, I think of when you talk about equipment and then just all these videos and pictures right now of just like the pretty much the enemy parading all of our stuff around. It's like, oh, like could you imagine like if there was stuff that you helped put in the hands of our, allies, and then it was like overnight just flipped, and now all of a sudden the enemy's like carrying around the stuff that you helped them establish. Like, what would that be like?
That was pretty frustrating. That's pretty frustrating.
Yeah,
we saw a little bit. Well, it wasn't nearly as bad, but with the rise of ISIS in Iraq after we left, we did leave equipment behind, but it was equipment that was put in the hands of the Iraqi government and the Iraqi military, and they did use it to fight ISIS. But turns out fighting ISIS was really hard. That's why ISIS was able to take over a large portion of Iraq and run their caliphate for a few years and do a lot of really bad things. So now we've got a similar situation going on in Afghanistan. the Taliban is complicated, but everyone thinks of the Taliban that was there in 2001 and kind of, I guess, hosted up Al Qaeda for the 9/11 attacks. They did a lot of bad things. It sounds like a lot of them still do a lot of bad things. There's this seeming effort on their part to gain some legitimacy on the world stage. I don't know how that'll go. And you've got ISIS-K and Al Qaeda still operating in Afghanistan, and it's a mess. And yeah, a lot of U.S. veterans are very frustrated with the way. I don't know anyone who thinks, oh, we should stay in Afghanistan forever, but certainly there's almost universal criticism of the way the United States withdrawal was handled, and no one's very optimistic about the future.
Right. I imagine that for a very long time, we will use this as an example or a use case of how not to do things, of how not to leave places without buttoning it up properly.
Yeah, or at least buttoning it up as properly as much as we can.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great argument that the whole war was misguided and we never should have gone in the way that we did. We shouldn't have stayed there for 20 years. We shouldn't have tried nation building. There's great arguments for all these things, but ultimately we begin from where we are. Mm-hmm. And where we are today is not where we were 2 months ago, and it's deteriorating quite rapidly. And it's unfortunate. It does no good to look back 20 years ago and say we should have done this or we should not have done that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little easier to look back to 2-3 months ago and say, what the hell was going on? Why was this done or why was that done? Because we'll say what we have in the present today was not set in stone 3 months ago.
Mm.
There were lots of opportunities for course correction. Seems to be the general consensus on both the left and the right looking at this. And those opportunities to correct the course were never taken. And it appears, at least it's the impression of most folks that I see, are that if you were trying to make things worse, you couldn't have done any better.
Yeah, well, apropos. So I have like a lot of questions that are kind of bubbling up that will probably take us in a lot of different directions. But since I just got an email from David, one of the other Symbolic World contributors, agreeing that he's open to having a trialogue with the three of us and discuss these, like, I went with it. 3-person conversation. I don't know, trialogue. So
didn't you coin Peugeotian?
Oh yeah. So speaking of like political endeavors, everybody, Peugeotian with a V. That's definitely the way to go. Anything else is just we're pretending here. It's doing a disservice. Yeah. And it's not the Peugeot brothers. It's most definitely the brothers Peugeot. So that's my 2 political boxes that I stand on in the symbolic world. I like that. So because there's a hope that we can really take a deep dive in this topic and zoom into that, maybe like, because he brings an interesting perspective coming from the Canadian military and serving in, I think it was Afghanistan, right?
Yeah, he was in Afghanistan.
Yeah, so I'm just like,
I believe he's still in the Canadian Reserve.
Oh, so yes, correct.
Still actively a soldier.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking like we could dive into that as far as your guys' experiences, foreign relations, but even like mix in like some of the symbolic interpretations, like what is it like to, send our military to the edge of the world, and what does that look like to the home or the center? So maybe we just like bookmark that for conversation trialogue number 2.
I think, yeah, I look forward to that conversation.
Yeah, me too. It's going to be a one of a kind first for at least this channel. So I'm just wondering, like, as far as your maturation, your development in life, uh, you didn't stick with the military. You ended up doing your service, and then what happened?
I coming back. I coming back from Iraq. My wife and I got married rather quickly. Um, 'Cause we were ready to get married. I just spent a little over a year in Iraq. Um, and I don't think she really wanted me to stay in the military, but I was also at that point, I felt like I had done my time playing GI Joe. I was glad I did, and I was ready to move on to bigger and better things. Um, wasn't sure what those were yet, but had coming back to the States, I had these ideas on what my sort of career, what direction my career would take. None of those are what actually happened.
Funny how that works.
uh,
Yeah.
I suppose there was another moving from one thing, not into anything else, but it was mainly just a moving out of, into another wilderness where there was some meandering, some wandering before, finding myself, a period of being nowhere before I found myself somewhere. Um, and so, yeah, my unit
Now,
was disbanded while I was in Iraq. And so when I came back, we were all getting assigned to new units. And I was close enough to the end of my contract that it didn't make a whole lot of sense for the military to like assign me to a new unit for 5 months
mhm.
before I went on to what's called a IRR status, where you're still in the system, but you don't have to do anything. They could theoretically call you to do something, but they very rarely do.
Mhm.
So I just went on to IRR status a few months early, and was happy to do that at the time.
Yeah, so how does that line up with Jung and Peterson and, finding yourself? Was it like you got back from the military and you dove into Jung, or how does that line up?
I started discovering Jung. This is I don't recall what year, might have been 2009. Well, yeah, so this would have been a little bit before. So I guess in the process of moving, I kind of describe it as a moving from Protestantism. Though I describe it as that retrospectively now. Uh, but there's a few writers that I discovered by happenstance, um, that really just blew me away. One was G.K. Chesterton. Um, the other was sort of a rediscovery of C.S. Lewis, who I'd read as a kid, but like I started reading some of his lesser known books, and was really interested in Lewis, and through Lewis discovered George MacDonald. I wrote
Mhm.
that two-part commentary on his The Golden Key, because that was a very, very influential little short text. It's only like 15 pages, the actual short story, so it's rather short. Um, but so these three writers were just kind of shook my world and then discovered Jung and jumped almost right into reading his Red book, which had been recently published. It was published in October of 2009. Um, and without getting into a bunch of Jung stuff, that's a very big tome of a book.
Yeah, right.
That is, most people who like Jung haven't read the Red. Most people who would be self-described Jungians probably haven't read the Red. So I started reading that when I was leaving for Iraq, and for my 2 weeks leave, a few months, I guess it was like 4 or 5 months into my time in Iraq, um, my then fiance, now wife, met me in Japan, and she brought me a present, and it was a massive $200 huge book. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a massive book of the Red Book, and so I got to travel around Japan with that wrapped in a shamag and fly on a plane. Huge book. It looked ridiculous. So anyway, spent most of my I did a lot of stuff in Iraq, but one of the things was I worked through the entire Red Book rather slowly.
Wow.
And I guess that was, if there was one thing that really was the highlight of my journey through the wilderness, it was definitely that. A lot of things going on there in that book. It rather defies classification and easy articulation. But and I wasn't entirely sure what it all meant, but I was sure that so much of what I was encountering was meaningful without having a proper, I guess, shelf to put it on in my own worldview. So read a fair bit of Jung outside of the Red Book, and Nietzsche and all and these sorts of guys, which really prepped me for easy reception of Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, it's just I find your background and like the groundwork that's being laid, all this time that you're putting in and searching, and all of a sudden like you add one person in the words that he's saying, and it seems to like synthesize and tie everything together.
And so during that time in Iraq is actually when my friend and I started that website, The Way to Actuality. And the idea was that there was this dichotomy between potentiality and actuality. A dichotomy, which I mean, even I still write about in life.
Yeah, it comes up in some of your articles.
A lot of the stuff that we wrote about, like, was in its early form then, at least in my mind. What I wrote was an early form, and I've kind of brought that forward through a lot of the experiences I've had, and it's in I don't want to say it's final form now, but in a much better, a more mature form now. So, but that was while I was in Iraq going through the Red Book as well. So we were running the website and writing articles. The comment sections were usually rather lively.
Awesome.
From lots of different backgrounds. We're getting sometimes heated arguments about meaning, and logos, and life, the universe, and everything. And so
so it seems like you've been at this and warm to the topic since long before, like, say, like the Symbolic World Zombie Apocalypse Facebook group and the Discord, and Jonathan Peugeot on the scene publicly. And
I forgot about. I don't have a Facebook account anymore, but yeah, the Facebook account that Jake Russell.
It's one of the only things that I miss about Facebook is that group. The other thing is, like, people around here in Lake County, they post a lot of things. So I feel like a little bit detached just from the local community, but just not worth it, man. I had too many friends and family members from all corners and different places in the world, like, just tear each other apart when it just happened too frequently in my comment section. So I was like, I want my friends and my family, so I'm out of here.
I look, for a long time I was a defender of Facebook, or at least a defender of the idea of Facebook, because I used to travel a bit. Obviously, spent a year in Iraq, and I used Facebook a lot while I was in paying community, just keep up with what was going on with friends and family back home. And I was really thankful for Facebook. With the Symbolic World Facebook group that Jacob created a couple of years ago, that is what sort of opened the door to meet all the symbolism people, which at this point been internet friends with for a few years. And so that's something that wouldn't have, I don't know that would have happened without Facebook. So leaving Facebook a little bittersweet. I've been able to stay in touch with most everybody in some fashion, through Signal or Discord or whatever. But it definitely opened up some fascinating discussions, and things kind of unfolded in a really cool way because of that Facebook group.
Yeah. Well, it led to the Symbolic World blog because that's where he did most of his recruiting. So like let's dive into that. So like I was reviewing my first article that was posted over a year ago,
Yeah,
reading yours on the sword, and it was just so interesting because I felt like both of them ended up doing the same thing where they were more trying to grapple with symbolism, like the big topic, than the actual subjects at hand. So in my case, it was talking about the symbolism of story and
yeah,
obituary writing and writing the gospels. It's like these impossible tasks, but like both of them have these like long like, well, let me explain symbolism first, and then that ended up being like, at least in my case, like the majority of the article and a little bit to have to do with story.
yeah, yeah. There's so I would say, especially for my first book, but I would say I still do that to some extent in some of my later ones. The Horse and the Rider, there's sort of a bit of a refresher on symbolism just generally, but I was really fascinated by all the talks that were going on about veils whenever the blog first popped up. And so I had this idea of Sword and Shield. I was thinking about, well, should I write something about dragons, or symbolism of dragons, or like I wanted to do something, kind of knight and dragony, romantic-y kind of thing. Uh, and then, but I was thinking about all this stuff with veils and the idea that there's veils all over the place in our lives, and really being able to take one way in which that is manifest using imagery that at least all the guys are going to be swords and shields. What kind of guy doesn't like swords and shields, and knights and armor and stuff?
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I kind of saw it as a way to talk about the symbolism of veils without specifically saying I was talking about veils, because everybody was talking about veils at the time. There were lots of YouTube conversations. Jonathan was talking about it left and right, so it was really popular back then. But then, because it was the early stages of the blog, I think that was one of the first articles
Mm-hmm.
that were on there. I don't. I think it was like in the first five. Um, Not wanting to assume that the readership had watched hundreds of hours of Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot and read
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Heinz book, right? So we can't assume that that's the case. So sort of using that first part of the article, and then later on in some of my other ones, hey, this is something I want to state this here, and I'll refer back to it later on. And a lot of my articles do refer back to those early, we'll say,
Mm-hmm.
definitions or articulations of what symbolism is.
Mm-hmm. And I really like your definition of symbolism. Like, so like let's see, thine own of thine own. You quoted the definition originally posted in Sword and Shield.
So yeah,
So you wrote the word in English, or the word symbolism in English arrives to us from the Greek symbolon, where it is a combination of the two words together and I throw or put. Then and subsequently, our word in English refers to a thing or idea that connects with other things or ideas via imparted or inherent meaning. Within the context of the cosmic hierarchy, that this site is heavily concerned with, a symbol is something that connects multiple levels of the hierarchy together within a particular ontological scheme. And I like this part especially. Symbols, like man himself, fuse matter from below and meaning from above. A symbol unites heaven and earth. So I really like that last part because, like, in rereading the symbolism of story, it's like I spend a large section of that trying to say what you did in that, like, you know, two sentence where I was trying to say, like, the story is not just, something that includes a lot of symbols, like, oh, he has a vase, right? Oh, well, what does that mean? Or like, I think of Christopher Nolan, right? His, maybe I'll make a video about this later, but like the secret to his success is that he can narrow his whole story down to one symbol. right? You think of prestige and it's two sides of the same coin,
Mm.
right? Inception is the top and
Yeah.
Batman is the bat plus the man. So I think about that, but it's like my point was like, no, no, no. Like the story is a symbol at the same time. And then I kind of like fumble my way through to try to express that. So like the fact that you're like, no, man himself, or excuse me, symbols like man himself, fuse matter from below and meaning from above. It unites heaven and earth.
Because everything is a symbol. Man is a symbol. Man unites heaven and earth. And like we uh I don't know if it was this article. It was another one of the ones where I quoted some old English because I really like old English stuff. Um, but in the old Germanic languages, and we see this in Tolkien, right? So the term Middle Earth, right? Middenjahr, Midgård, like the idea that it's like the place for men. We see this in Cadman's hymn, right? So I quote this in another one of my articles,
Mm-hmm.
where it in the second stanza it says that God first, the holy shaper first made heaven and earth, and then gives man the middle earth, the Middenjahr. So it's this idea of man in the middle of heaven and earth, mediating the two. And we see this. I think Cadman talks about it. Like this is the essential structure. This is part of what Mathieu's entire book is about. You get nothing from Mathieu's book. Like you should at least be able to walk away with this basic structure of heaven above, earth below, and like there's this union that happens in between. And symbols are those things, to include we ourselves and everything, that are uniting with this meaning from above and matter from below. The matter like gives the body to the higher thing. It's like it's a beautifully simple pattern that no matter how complex I guess the discussion gets about symbolism or this or that, you can take Jonathan's recent uh, article video about Montero, that song and witchcraft and all sorts of stuff. And it's a complex thing going on. But that basic pattern is what we see manifested throughout at all of us. It's fractal. Mm-hmm. And heaven is above, earth is below, and this something symbols are what happens when they touch. Mm-hmm. Throughout our lives, throughout our experience of reality. This is everywhere. So, well, I mean, once you start seeing symbolism, you see symbolism everywhere, right? And symbolism happens.
Yeah, and then that's the Pajovian warning is, don't go crazy. Don't rush.
Great people to go crazy. There was an article that came out on the blog a month or two ago, I guess, about the symbolism of Cyclops, which was fantastic, which I don't know if you read that. Really, really good. But sort of about that. The Cyclops doesn't have one eye. The Cyclops has three eyes. And the two lower eyes are permanently closed. And the Cyclops can only see out of the third eye, the heavenly eye, the spiritual eye, as it were. And it can't see through the earthly eyes. And so its head is always in the clouds. Man, however, in the mythology, also has three eyes, but it's the upper third eye that's closed. And so man's vision is earthly and mundane, whereas the Cyclops' vision is up and in the clouds. And a lot of times, like you see this in the Odyssey, like the basic mundane common sense sort of things aren't apparent to the Cyclops. Like the Cyclops almost looks stupid in the way that Odysseus fools the Cyclops. Because their heads in the clouds, all they see is the heavenly things. They don't see the earthly things with any clarity.
Right.
Chesterton, I was thinking about this earlier today. This is sort of, I guess, brief aside, but like he has a quote. I think it's either in Orthodoxy or in the Everlasting Man, where he says, "Our spiritual sight is stereoscopic, like our physical sight. We see two images all at the same time, yet we see all the better because of it. And like that idea,
Wow, man, that's
yeah, if you ever heard Chesterton, man, you should read Chesterton.
that is that is something to think about. Stereoscopic
Yep.
sight.
Two images at once
Interesting.
will be all the better because of
Interesting. Uh, Garrett, yeah, so okay, what I'm really wondering is the directionality that you bring up in most all of your articles so far is above and below, and the direction. I really like how in The Horse and the Rider you introduce the ladder,
it.
where you use the rungs of the ladder to describe directionality. And so if I'm getting it right, it's like the rungs of the ladder, and then you also bring in the sexual symbolism as well. So like the, and you could probably describe this better, but like how would you best sum up what you lay out in The Horse and the Rider with the ladder and directionality?
Yeah, so the we talk about the hierarchy of being, or the hierarchy. You hear Jonathan talk about this. You hear lots of folks in the space talk about hierarchy. And hierarchy implies something above and something below. That's generally what we mean when we say hierarchy in simplistic sense. So being is a verb. So, and being is like to what a thing is being, or what a person is being, what a symbol is being at any given point, is a place on this ladder of being, on this hierarchy of being. Everything that is above is masculine in relationship to what is below. Everything that is below is feminine in relationship to that which is above it. So like you can think of this in terms of like a mother. So like a woman is obviously feminine in relationship to a man, like in that sense. Not that she's more important than or superior than, but symbolically the feminine, that which receives from above, because what's above emanates from above in and is embodied into that which is below. So like the wife is feminine in relation to the husband, but the mother is masculine in relation to the children, because the children are below her in this same ladder. So you can sort of begin to see the stratification of it. Now, that's not the end all of it, because the ladder isn't a two-dimensional ladder that we draw in MS Paint, right? The ladder is a model. You can as well talk about a ziggurat or a mountain. It all works.
Yeah,
But with the ladder,
Alistair Roberts, he brought that up in our conversation. He said the same thing. He's like, you could
I
think of it
think
more of a ziggurat,
yeah,
kind of pyramid, like narrowing at the top with steps.
yeah, yeah. I think it was actually your conversation with him that made me think about the ziggurat as again as a man-made mountain. Obviously, it is. But once you can see the stratification of the ladder, stratification of the mountain, stratification of the hierarchy, the cosmic hierarchy, even at just a small level, then you get a sense of what the pattern is, and then you can start to see it everywhere. It's like you're seeing the heaven and the earth through all of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you can imagine a circle, where a circle represents a family, the mother and the father each sit at the edge of the circle, but where the mother looks in, the father looks out.
Hmm.
So, and the children exist within. So the family is a single ontological unit. The family is being the family. And the individual, we'll say unwed male or female, is not less, they have less capability than the family unit. But in order to participate in the family unit, the totality of the single male or the single female must be, we'll say, given up in, so the part must be sacrificed in favor of the whole, and the whole is the family, which is the united masculine and feminine with progeny as its product. So like this is essentially like we see heaven in this pattern laid out just within the family unit itself. We see the rungs in the ladder. We see the I would say equality of the masculine and the feminine in that they both define. It's the united masculine and the feminine that defines the family unit, defines that the line that makes the circle, right?
Mm-hmm.
The mother looks in, the father looks out, and we see this. So in the Orthodox liturgy, most of the time the priest faces the altar. Sometimes the priest will turn around and face the people in the nave. But we see this at play here as well. And this is where we kind of get into the symbolism of like the priest king. And we see this in the priest and the way he faces in the liturgy. So when the priest faces the altar, he's representing the people to heaven, or the people to God. He images the people and sort of acts as this coalescent identity of he is the people standing before God. But then there's times where he turns to either read the gospel or to bring the Eucharist out. When he turns and faces the people, he's no longer representing the people to God, but rather he represents heaven to earth, heaven to the people, God to the people. Before the Eucharist is distributed in the Orthodox liturgy, the veil is pulled closed, and the priest partakes of the bread and the wine, privately and by himself, and the clergy will as well. So this is behind the iconostasis. The people in the nave can't see this. They're singing, they're doing various prayers while this is going on, but the priest does it behind closed doors. And then he takes chalice and turns, he draws back the veil, he opens the doors, and the people say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord is God and has revealed himself unto us." So the priest gives what was given to him, but he mediates this through this heavenward motion, this earthward motion, right? So there's, and getting into like my article about the Eucharist, there's this heavenward motion of the people as we bring the elements that constitute the body and blood into the Holy of Holies, and we'll put it on the altar. This is a heavenward motion because people gather that grain and those grapes, they fashion it into wine, they fashion it into bread, and then they bring it heavenward. But then there's this thing that happens, and then the result is more than bread and wine, that as the priest turns and faces the people with the now changed bread and wine, it's more than that now. Its identity includes that, but something more has been added, because that earthward motion from heaven at the epiclesis, the descent of the Holy Spirit onto the elements, now the priest gives as it was given to him, and he comes down into the nave itself, and the people come up, and so you see this motion actually throughout the Orthodox liturgy. Everything that's done towards the altar is done heavenly. Whenever actions are done from the altar into the nave, these are earthward directions. So we see this played out there in the icon of the Annunciation. So the tradition is that the Theotokos lived in the temple, and part of her job was to mend the fabrics that were used in the ritual worship of the Jewish temple at the time. In the icon of the Annunciation, we see the Archangel Gabriel speaking to her and letting her know that she's going to have a son and all this stuff, right? It's going to be Jesus. He's going to be the Savior of the world. Mary is usually holding needle and thread. Sometimes behind her, you can see this like bundled up fabric. It's the veil of the temple she is mending, right? Most, but not all of the icons have another veil that's present. And the veil is stretched usually above buildings, which are behind it. The veil separates heaven and earth, and you see a ray of the Holy Spirit piercing the veil and coming down to the Theotokos. That veil we would normally see in the church itself or in the temple itself, separating the nave from the sanctuary, or the holy place from the holy of holies. But because of the perspective of the icon, that it's kind of hard to get that. And so for whatever reason, and there's probably more reasons than just the one I'm talking about, we see the veil stretched out across, literally separating the sky and what's going on the earth, and the ray of the Holy Spirit piercing through it. And so again, we see this earthward motion of that which is heavenly, coming down through the veil, through the thing, with that ladder. You can think of the rungs as the veils between the different categories, or you can think of the spaces between the rungs as the veils between the categories. Either way works. Perhaps it makes more sense to imagine them as the veil as being within the space between the rungs, because their space is empty, and so there's potentiality there.
It's like defining space,
Yeah,
inside, outside, before, after,
above and below. So we experience this ladder. We don't exist at just one point in the ladder, but we do exist at one point. We interact with the reality itself via multiple rungs on the ladder. So we have the word ascend, which means to go up. We have the word descend, which means to go down. But the capacity to transcend is the ability to go up and down, right? And so we can engage with the world at lower levels. We can engage with the world at higher levels. All of us, whether we're religiously minded or not, inevitably engage with the world at both a lower level, where we are hungry, so we eat. We're cold, so we shiver. So like there's this physical expression to reality at the lower levels. We might call this the place of the scientific worldview, where physical observations reign supreme. There's a higher level that even those who aren't religious inevitably participate in. When you talk about how do you know your spouse loves you, like we can say, well, I've seen them do this and this and this, and to the best of my knowledge, they've never cheated on me and all this stuff. And so you can list all these reasons as to why you have a high degree of confidence that they do love you, but you can never be 100% sure if you're only engaging with it at this lower level. There's no way to reach, it's like reaching the speed of light. You'll never hit that last decimal point. But if we engage with the experience, the encounter of a husband and a wife, or one person with another through friendships, like something new is added, something that's higher than those things, but also it partakes in those lower things. The experiences you've had with your wife play into all of this. They don't go away. They're not unimportant. They're not, the bread and the wine are not unimportant in the Eucharist. There's that which is lower is the embodiment of that which is higher. The love that the spouses have for one another exists not in this lower level of firing synapses and the neurological correlations that we see and do occur. It happens at a higher level. And so this ladder, this hierarchy, like I think it's the pattern manifests itself ad nauseum and ad infinitum. It is like you see it, you'll go crazy because you see it everywhere, because it is everywhere. This is the basic structure of reality.
Yeah, it's so interesting that what you're laying out is you can basically have your unity and multiplicity at the same time, at different levels, at different scales, even.
Yeah, it's because it's not a two-dimensional ladder.
Right.
It's 1,000, whatever dimension. There's a lot of dimensions to the ladder. It's like that fractal. You can zoom in at any point in the fractal image, and you see the same image. It's not that you have to zoom into a particular point. You can zoom into any point, and you see the pattern play itself out again and again and again.
So I pulled up the image that David Flores did in conjunction with your Eucharist article.
Yes.
And I find it interesting that it seems like on the borders, there's this ladder or categorical type of progression. And I'm not even sure if he did that intentionally or not. It might be cool to have him on and have the two of you, add your own commentary to the different parts that you added to that work. But
Yeah, that's a lie. I don't think that was deliberate, but now that you mention it, it's obviously there, and I think that really works. Maybe he did it deliberately, but like,
yeah, maybe we'll have him on and I don't know if he's willing to reveal his secrets, but
I know we talked about. So you can see the image of the cross, obviously, in that vertical border.
uh-huh.
So like the idea is that through fermentation and throughout everything, the wheat and the grapes have to die in order to become that higher thing. But
Mm-hmm.
wine isn't a thing unless there are people to enjoy it, right? If there were no people to drink wine, grapes would just ferment, would die into nothing. They wouldn't become wine. That they become wine is because the meaning emanates from above and the matter emerges from below. And so, but it's through death that
Right.
that transition occurs, that change occurs. And so the crosses that you see there are indicating that. But yeah, no, the idea of them being latter, I really like it. I think that's correct as well.
Yeah, right. And because like categories are so important. Like, gosh, this of course gets back to, well, gosh, anything gets back to the creation story where it's like Adam's naming animals. It's like we have to do that. Scientists do that. We do this every day. We have to name things because we have to focus our attention of what a thing is and what it's not, because I'm not sure humans can exist outside of that. And so the fact that these categories, you could think of what separates an identity of one thing to the next, would have to be veiled in a certain way. Otherwise, how could we distinguish anything from anything else?
Yeah.
But what I really liked about how you brought in the spouse and the family, uh, what's really cool about kind of like, I guess, tying the theme, that thread that goes throughout your articles, is how you talk about the ontological unit being greater than the sum of its parts, or but at the same time it doesn't negate them or eliminate them. It's like they're able to maintain personhood and identity, but at the same time the unity that comes in being an ontological unit. And what's cool about the horse and the rider is that you make the point where it's like, no, actually, the cool thing, and what I try to tell people, I'm like, being in a family is awesome. Being a dad's awesome because it expands you. Like,
Yeah.
you make your sacrifice, right? Because like I can't just sit at home and make, video essays for YouTube all day. At this point I have a day job and I'm making sacrifice. Like, I'm specifically doing that for other people, namely the provision of my family, this ontological unit. And at the same time, by doing that, like part of me dying, or a lot of me dying, in order to become an addition to this bigger unit, it also expands me through progeny, through spouse, through our family unit. So just like the writer, because he sacrifices using his legs. He can't run anymore. But because he's willing to do that, he gets to unite with the horse and go like 10 times, 100 times faster than he ever could. And likewise, like, this is not a one-sided direction, because I love how you say it's the horse that, through its contact and relationship with its rider, um, it sacrifices its wild side, its freedom, where it just roams the grasslands and feeds off of hay and the who knows what. Like, now it gets touched by nobility and humanity, and now it gets to do even more things than it ever could have.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so in the horse and rider article, I talk a little bit about the story of Actaeon. David Flores did a really good article on that. It's worth reading. But there's, like, you see that stratified hierarchy, like, laid out really interestingly in that story, where you have Actaeon is a hunter. He has hounds. He has dogs that hunt with him. The dogs and he are hunting deer, but like the deer and the dogs are both lower beasts, as it were. But the dogs, through their contact with him, become something more. They're part of his ontological hunting unit, right? His capacity is expanded because he uses dogs to hunt. He can do more. He can cover more ground. At least he's able to project his will further in the earth than he could if he were to only rely on his four limbs, right? And now he can rely. He's got 5 dogs. He's got all of their limbs as well, and their speed and their agility and their smell and sight. Like all of this stuff becomes a projection of his own will into the lower regions of the world as the dogs become more than mere beasts. They become more than the prey that they hunt, more than the deers that they hunt. They're obviously animals like the deers. And to that extent, Actaeon is a man, like a monkey, right? There's this animality that our humanity partakes of, but humans are more than mere animal, right?
Mm-hmm.
At least we act that way. If you stop acting that way, then you get pretty terrible things in the world. So, but you see this stratified thing throughout the story of Actaeon, where especially with the dogs, and then eventually he gets cast down into the realm of animality or higher animality, and the dogs can't even tell the difference between their former master and the deers that are the prey that they hunt. It's a fascinating story that really shows that hierarchy laid out, shows ascent and descent throughout it. It's fascinating.
So something else that I really liked from, let me share it again. So the other point worth noting on this image is how J.P. Marceau, he talked a lot about Miracles, the book written by C.S. Lewis. There's a conversation we had that he's had other conversations with lots of other people, John Vervaeke and Paul Van der Klee among them. But the cool thing that I liked about this image is that I'm not sure if this is intentional, but it explains 2 arguments within one image. So 2 Lewis arguments in his book Miracles. So one is down here we have grapes and we have the grain. And he distinguishes the 2 main categories of miracles as they're understood in Christendom as of the old kind and of the new kind. And he's saying the old kind is that, like this is a regular process, and it just takes time, right? So over the course of a year, a couple seasons or a growing season, you look at the grapes down here, and with time and harvest and, a dormant time of, fermentation, then it emerges as wine. And so whenever Jesus turns, water into wine, it's really just something that already takes place in the world. He does in an instant. And over on the right side, you have the grain, right? So then he makes bread. And of course, this is like, again, like manifesting bread. It's something that he just did in an instant when he multiplies it. And it's not like there's something new happening. It's just the time factor, that increment is, instead of a season, it's an instant. Yeah. So that's the old kind. But then the new kind is what's taking place in the center, which is this like interesting, how would you say, like incarnational event where these elements, that find that place in the middle where heaven's materialized by these elements, and these elements are elevated at the same time. So you get that direction again. And so the incarnation, he was arguing, is something of a newer kind, especially the other miracle within that category is the resurrection, where we're invited to be resurrected, rebirthed in the new age as creatures of a new kind, which is veiled and it's somewhat of a mystery. But I just loved how this image, as I'm looking at it right now, is like, oh, I don't know if David Morris meant this, but he's like imagistically explaining the miracle categories that C.S. Lewis lays out in his book.
Yeah, it's a there. So there's talking about like the incarnational aspect of, like, especially that central image. You'll see like there's a lot of circles that are drawn there. You've got the circle of the halo,
Yeah,
Theotokos. You have the circle of the halo, obviously around the head of the Christ child. You have the circle that's representing her womb. There's another halo around the seraphim, but then there's another circle, and this is where I really like what David did here. So he sort of mixed a little bit of like Orthodox and Catholic imagery. So the vestment, it looks sort of like an Orthodox vestment, but the this raising of the elements is in a more Roman Catholic kind
like
of
with
style.
the wafer shaped bread.
The wafer shape and the way it's done. So that's the way Catholics do it.
Okay.
And he did it like that because it works really well with what's going on here. So you see the circle sort of mirrors the circle that we see the logos, we see Christ in. But the chalice, you read this in the Fathers, the chalice is the womb of the Theotokos, right? This is the body in this sense. So like there's lots of ways you could examine the symbolism of the Eucharist forever. But like one of the ways to look at it is this, that the chalice that sits on the altar is like the womb of the Theotokos. Like it's filled with the waters of womanhood in which the potential for life is. So this incarnation that we have going on, like that womb of the Theotokos that we see, and this is you talked about a lot of this in your unburnt bush article, like the Christ within, like we see that mirrored in the raising of the elements by the priest here.
Yeah, so there's lots of things there. So there's a point where you have this awesome small paragraph where you like pack in a lot. Let's see, where is it? Let's see. So there's the talk. Oh, so in one place where you talk about this, how'd you say it, like climactic moment that's captured in this image, you bring up that the examples of the Theotokos, the vessels of clay, the unburnt bush, aka burning bush, as well as the bread and wine. I'm wondering, like, how are all these things related, and why are you using those as examples in this moment?
Let me read that. Should I just read the paragraph real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I know, I'm reminded about what specifically you're referring to. Not unlike the descent of the Holy Spirit into the womb of the Theotokos, when the communicant imbibes the body and blood of his God, he is filled to overflowing, and an earthen vessel of clay mysteriously becomes the host for the eternal God. Like the unburnt bush of Moses, he burns but is not consumed, as the divinity becomes immediately present within both his body and his being, for God remains veiled by the mystery of his descent into the lower matter of bread and wine. So obviously, and I linked to your article there. I think
I thought that connection was fascinating. It got me like really thinking this week as I was reviewing it. So how are you tying those two things together? This, burning bush, where like it's hosting the presence of the flames, but the flames are not in fact, burning the wood. It's the two things are able to happen at the same time.
So we have this descent. And this is part of what happens. I don't think I've written too terribly extensively about this. There might be a reference here or there, but there's a proper way to ascend the ladder. There's an improper way. There's a proper way to descend the ladder and an improper way. We see an improper descent in the accounts in Genesis of the sons of God came down to the daughters of men, right? In this story that's elaborated on in the Enochic literature of angels who did not, to quote the book of Jude, angels who did not keep their heavenly abode, right, but descended. In Enoch 2, it says they broke their promise on the summits of Mount Hermon. They violated something sacred when they descended. They descended improperly, and there's destruction, like bad things happen as a result. The icon of the Annunciation, we have the piercing of the veil that I was talking about earlier. So the Holy Spirit comes down into the womb of the Theotokos, and the Theotokos says, "May it be as the Lord commands." Like this is the ultimate yes of mankind to God. This is the assent, the saying yes to the will of heaven that we see in the Theotokos. Because of this, right? Because of the willful acceptance of the will of that which is above, a vessel which is too small to really be able to contain the Logos, yet contains the Logos. Because of this, we can maybe imagine, if this is a little speculative, but like we can imagine the bush, the burning bush, like maybe there was like a moment of encounter where the bush says yes. And that saying yes is what allows the indwelling spirit of Yahweh to descend upon it so that it burns but is not consumed. And so the communicant in the liturgy, in the Eucharist, as we participate in this unbloody sacrifice, right? We say yes, as the Theotokos said yes, as the bush said yes, right? We say yes. And so we do it physically, like we take in the body and blood of the Logos, and we are changed, right? What was before, like something new has been added yet again, something from above. We're our small earthen vessels, right? Pots of clay are frail and fragile. Could we contain the source of all being? Yet this is what happens, and this is and that's why I say there's a mystery. God, there's still a veil that's present. Like many of the veils are torn away as we like start to look at it like this, but like there's still a veil of mystery. Like there's still a place where we cannot pass. We can apprehend the energies of God, but not His essence. Right? There's this darkness there that we cannot go. So there's still a mystery. I'm not explaining this in a mechanistic fashion, but we see the symbolism, we see the pattern laid out, and it's the same thing going on. The proper descent of the God into the image of God. Right? You can think of Peter Pan as a shadow, and that shadow goes astray. What a shadow ought to do is everything that the being itself does. In Peter Pan, this doesn't go right? So this is part of what it means to be the image of God. That Christ says that the Son can do nothing except what He sees the Father do. There's this unity of motion, right? And we see this in the horse and the rider as well. The will of the rider is manifested into the limbs of the horse, the powerful limbs. Does the horse understand? When Caesar rode a horse in triumph in Rome, like does the horse understand what's going on? Maybe to some extent, right? It's a well-trained horse, but not the way that Caesar does, not the way that the Romans do. When the horses are used in battle, they understand the frenzy, the primal frenzy and the violence, but like, do they understand how pivotal this particular battle is for the well-being of the people for the next 3 centuries? Like, the horse doesn't understand this, but it can yet partake in it by assenting to the will from above. And the will of the man who rides the horse is so much greater than, at least is capable of so much more complex nuance than the will of the horse. Yet, in a way, they're united, and they act as one. Um, and despite the greater will of the rider, the horse is not destroyed. That can happen. Like there's examples. You can easily imagine situations where a horse and a rider don't jive so well for whatever serious reason.
Would that be like an improper descent?
Possibly.
Right. It's like the human from above was not able to train or bring down the plan or the pattern, the purpose to in a way that the horse was able to receive it.
To receive. So I talk a bit about Alexander and Bucephalus, the horse, right? Where as a young child, Alexander sees his father and some folks interacting with this really, really wild horse. And his father is like, well, we'll just send him away. Alexander, as a young man, says, no, let me try to tame him. They all laugh and say, yeah, you can't do that. His father says, if you can't tame him, you have to pay for the horse. If you are able to do it, we'll give you the horse. And Alexander realizes that the horse, because of the way the sun is, the horse is afraid of his own shadow, which is really Jungian. He's afraid of his own shadow.
Yeah, interesting.
Alexander positions the horse in a way that the horse can't see his shadow anymore. So he makes the shadow go away, and he's able to get on Bucephalus, and in imagery and in iconography and in symbols for the next 1,000 years, if even more so, because we see this image continually replicated in European art. But we see two things like all the time when we see images of Alexander and his conquest of the world. We see him on his horse, and that horse is right. His will, and it's sort of implied, right? He does it, right? Is that we talk about Alexander's empire, but in a way it's Alexander and Bucephalus' empire. In a way, Bucephalus doesn't understand it like that, but like we can see how that's true in a way.
When I think of the rider and the mount, I've been reading through the Old Testament, through Saul, David, Solomon. I've been really getting into that recently. And what I noticed is these multiple mentions of the king riding a donkey or a mule or something that's, how would you say, lower than a horse.
Yeah.
And I just find that interesting that the rider and the mount is part of that, but then it's echoed in the New Testament with the triumphal entry of, Christ the King, riding the lowly donkey. Yeah. And I've heard this interesting comment, I think it was Alistair Roberts, where he's like sharing a theory or an idea where you could say that symbolically Christ to the mule would be like God to Israel, right? So the rider and his mount, and so it was like this proper relationship where this mule, right, or donkey, this very lowly of the horse category creatures, was elevated because it was able to host, the incarnated king.
Yeah, that's another great example of that same pattern. And the idea of it being a donkey or a mule, still horse-like in that horse category, but generally understood to be lower, more humble, not generally used as a means of waging war. No one rides on a donkey in a triumph.
Right? And maybe they're contrasting it with Alexander's image with the horse, this white steed, muscles and, the fastest and the best.
Well, so even the horses, and this is something that I mentioned, it's like there's something about, especially like a wild stallion, like stallions we describe stallions in the wild as noble. Like this is a common way of describing.
Yeah, interesting. I remember watching The Black Stallion as a kid, 90s movie.
That was a great series of books. I really like the Black Stallion books.
Yeah.
But the stallion or the war horse is still a majestic thing, right? And so if the king, who is above, takes only the cream of the crop of that which is lower. Perhaps there's a message here that even if there's a mule or a donkey, then the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords will still ride, and that your our lack, our impoverished state is no barrier to us participating in the triumph of the Logos through Jerusalem.
Hey man, is this going to be your follow-up article to the horse and the right?
Maybe.
I like it, man. I like where it's going. You also bring up kingly figures like the Riders of Rohan, and you bring up that element of the epithet. So, what were you explaining with the epithet and the Riders of Rohan?
So I think I was specifically referencing Theoden.
Yes, the king.
Who has various epithets. Epithet being like we see epithets in the writings of Homer ubiquitously, like in the Iliad. We see like as he mentions gods, he often refers to them by epithets, so names of not necessarily their proper name. So he might call Apollo. It's all escaping me. Hang on.
Yeah, in the article you say Theoden is called Horsemaster, and the power and fury which is summoned, coupled with the thundering earth under the countless hooves, as they charge to face the enemies of men, showing us the meaning of such an epithet.
Yeah. So epithet is, and to use examples from like again from the Iliad, because I couldn't remember any of Apollo's epithets for whatever reason. He's often called bright Apollo, right? Because he's like the sun and this. So it's a way of describing not just who they are, but what they are. That's this sort of functional being, this functional ontology. So Theoden is horse master, right? Because Rohan is this kingdom which is known for their horses and their cavalry. So he, being the master of Rohan, is the master of Rohan's horses as well.
Yes. So, okay.
But there's what else did I say about that
there? It's kind of cool you're adding your own, circling back for your own commentary and lessons. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't written as much as a lot of people, but I've written enough where I don't always remember every single thing that I say. Yeah. So and again, yeah. So in there. So in that imagery of King Theoden being horsemaster, thinking of Rohan as this kingdom of horsemasters, he's the king. So the king is, if the kingdom is a family, the king is masculine in relationship to all of the residents of the kingdom. They are all feminine in relationship to him. Whereas we could use the example of the queen looks in on the kingdom, the king looks out. And whenever people talk about and we do this as well. When the United States, when we're talking about foreign policy and we talk about, Russia's doing this or Russia's doing that, or we might say Putin's doing this, Putin's doing that. And in a way, those are almost interchangeable, because Vladimir Putin, as the leader of the Russian Federation, he presents the Russian people, the Russian state to the world. So Theoden as well. Also with that idea of like the priest in liturgy, when he faces the altar, he presents the people to God. When he faces the people, he presents God to the people. And so there is the king, like the father and the mother.
So it's this moment in the image when he turns away from facing the people, faces the altar. This moment that's laid out in the image is happening, and it's almost like it's actually, I'm looking at this. This is like a horizontal mountain, where like the bottom part of the mountain, the base being like the population of the kingdom or the nation, the church, comes to a point where the priest is, and he's like the representative at that point. So like we have the mountain like this, but now it's kind of like this, spatially inside the church. And then I would just say the inverse or mirror of that is happening, from heavenward towards that point of where the priest is.
Yep, that's heavenward. Yeah. So here's the thing. So churches, Orthodox churches, of course, but in theory, so Catholic churches, Orthodox churches they face east, right? So they don't face Jerusalem, they just face east, right? Muslims will pray towards Mecca.
Right. Yeah, they face Mecca. I believe it is.
Churches always face east. They face east because God dwells in the east. So even if a physical church building, so for instance, our church building here in Lafayette, it's a repurposed building. It doesn't actually face like east. Like if you were to let's put a compass there, it doesn't actually face east physically, but it does face east spiritually. And so this idea of the mountain being inverted horizontally, this is where we get spiritual directionality, which like we use we use physical language to describe not physical things. We use temporal language to describe eternal things because we have no other language. It's the way our thoughts work. It's the way our mind works. It's why we have to deal in metaphors a lot of times, because we don't have the tools to interact directly with these higher things. But we know that they're there. And so we use St. Ephrem in his Hymns of Paradise talks about this, how God condescends into the language, into the metaphor of man. Not because God is limited to our metaphors. When we talk about God having sight, he doesn't have sight the way we have sight, but there's use of language which is understandable, intelligible to us. We have something kind of like God's sight, but it's so small, right? As to almost be completely different. But the use of that language, St. Ephrem says, shows the love and the grace of God. He's willing to condescend to our humble speech, though not be bound by it and not be limited by it.
I think of I look at this image and I can see how it would confuse maybe a lot of Protestant viewers or people that have that type of background, because it's really important that there are no things, no ladders or mountains or veils or anything between us and Christ. That Christ's job was to like remove all of that. So I don't know, man, what would your response be to people that are in that place, or when they look at this image?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about it. There's so the actual physical image hangs on the wall in my house. Whenever you walk through the front door, it's almost immediately on the right. So anyone who comes into the front door will see it. Vast majority of my friends and family are not Orthodox, and so they'll recognize some Catholic-y looking imagery and just probably aren't even going to give it a second thought.
Right.
I don't know. So the whole article was, I think, more than most of my others, sort of just assumes a lot about the reader. I don't go into a lot of this is what symbolism is in the Eucharist article, and I wanted the image to speak for itself.
Yeah, I like the brevity of that article, where it kind of marries the image. It kind of leans on the image, like in a Matthew Pajovian sense, where like
that is
the meaning can be expressed. Like you just need a little bit of verbal nudging in order to see the image correctly.
Yeah, so to him who has eyes to see, let him see. To him who has ears,
right,
to let him hear. Right? I think I'll say that. So for a while, this is the way I described my experience of the Red Book. It was very, very profound and influential to me, but I never recommended that anyone read it. And I sort of felt, you know, this back in the years before I was Orthodox, I felt that if someone had reached a point in their life where they needed to read it, then they would. When they were at a place where they were receptive to it.
No, when the student is ready, the master will appear. Something like that.
Something like that. Yes, speak only when you have something worth being heard, and only then if you know that it will be heard. You know, to take more the opposite end of it. There's so with this article, because there were a couple folks that said, you know, this isn't really, it's a good article, but it's not really, if people who aren't really symbolically inclined might not understand it. And I was okay with that.
Yeah, well, there's a place for articles at that level too, because people that spend a couple years, you know, studying this stuff or their whole life, you know, being in a, say, like an Eastern church background, you know, like they have that foundation of perspective, or that foundation that provides a perspective that would allow them to understand more of the nuances and the detail.
Yeah, and even, I mean, even you who aren't Orthodox, but you know, you're still in this space, like you're able to like see the meaning that's there that David put in behind the, you know, the lines and the ink.
Mm-hmm. Whether he did it intentionally or not, I guess we have to ask him. I know there's a lot of intentionality here, but I think there's a lot of those, that there's a big element of intuition that goes in with art too, where
Definitely.
you just put things together in a way that they, like, how would you say it, a proper descent, right?
Yeah.
Would be the artist properly assembling all of the earthly marks.
Yep. And that's I think ultimately the best art. The best art is not that which emerges from below, but that which 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 emerges from below and emanates from above. This is
Mm-hmm.
This is an important thing. It's not an either or, it's a both and. The lower things must rise, but they don't rise for themselves. The higher things must descend, but they do not descend just to descend and descend blindly and mindlessly. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's that meeting, and this is the symbol. The
Yeah.
meeting of heaven and earth, the uniting of heaven and earth. And
You know, there's the other thing too that you brought up, which is, you know, like, yeah, the heaven, you could think of it, well, as a category, you know, just to lay out the argument, I'll just say, like, heaven as a category descends good ordering principles and bad ones, or ones that unify, ones that so like an artist could be doing good work, or it could be doing diabolical work. Kind of depends on what's informing the lifting up, or the how they put their art together.
yeah, and I think this is part of why sacred art is very different from, let's say, modern art. With modern art, the artist is the apex of the system, of the hierarchy. It is the artist who raises up elements and shapes them to his whim. The sacred artist does something different. The sacred artist knowingly mediates heaven and earth. The sacred artist, the iconographer, with there's various forms of sacred art, but the takes the paint and the wood, or the soapstone, or the musical instruments, or the
or the vocabulary too,
or the vocabulary, takes these lower things and raises them up. But like the priest does in this image, he does not raise them up and just eat them himself, but he raises them up to heaven. And then heaven comes down. And then the artist then takes that thing, which has become changed by it, by the lifting up of it, and redistributes it out into the world. Like that's what sacred art itself is.
in the New Testament, when they talk about the divine ladder, well, throughout the Bible, they talk about the ladder. I see angels ascending and descending. And I just find that I'm really enjoying this conversation. I wish that it wouldn't end, but this might be a good way to button it up, where in this divine cosmic ziggurat shaped, three-dimensional shapes, ladder that explains and orders and embodies the cosmic world that we inhabit, uh, things are ascending and descending at the same time.
Yes.
And there's meeting places at every point along and up and down that ladder.
I think that is a succinct way of expressing
it. Well, I look forward to more of your essays to come, and look forward to some of my draft submissions too for Symbolic World, because I'm overdue, that's for sure. The last thing I want to do before we close this conversation is come up with a title for our conversation. So I don't know, I'm thinking maybe play on the directionality part of it, asking for directions from Gareth Boyd, or symbolic directionality matters, or heavenward, earthward. I don't know, what do you think? What would be catchy but yet describing what we're talking about?
So I think when I reflect back on this conversation, which has gone for how long?
About 2 hours. I'm really hoping we broke the 2 hour barrier. It's like a sound barrier for my long form podcast.
Oh, I hope we did too. I love long form.
I feel like on Top Gear, how they have all of their guests go around the track and they race and they measure their time, and they oh, who has the fastest time? I do that, but it's inverted. It's who has the longest time? I don't know.
Really, people's patience.
Yeah.
That's how you know it was good. I listen to everything at 2x, so this would just be a 1 hour.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We'll need to talk about that one in the future too.
Yeah, so I think when I think back on these brief 2 hours, it's been sort of, we had the outline we started with, but it was rather meandering, exploratory. So it was very much an exploration. Talked a lot about, obviously, directionality, heavenward, earthward, and ascent and descent. Those probably shaped the majority of it. So it was definitely an exploration of something of a cosmic compass.
Hey, I like that. Cosmic compass. Yeah, asking for directions using the cosmic compass. I don't know.
That's good. I like
that. All right. Well, nice. If you think of more, feel free to reach out. I'll probably post this in the next couple of days.
Awesome, man.
And
a lot of fun.
Yeah, so viewers, if you're still tuned in at this point, go check out his stuff. Remember to like and subscribe this channel, as well as to read and listen to Gareth's work if you haven't already started. And look forward to the potential of having the trialogue with Gareth and David. Well, I guess both Davids at this point, because I'm really curious to hear the artistic side of this image that we ended up talking a lot about, or kind of leaning upon.
I'm really cool. I felt like, I don't know, I feel like this image is finally getting the attention it deserves.
Well, I'm glad I could facilitate it. Yeah, I hope it gets more and more.